Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a moment for people to keep coming in, and then we'll get started. I think you're ready to go, Steven, and then if people keep coming in, I can admit them.
All right, sounds good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Elliott. I'm the Director of Watershed Programs here at PPA, and I also have the pleasure of working for the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. So the majority of my duties are related to green stormwater infrastructure through our landscape makeover program. I also deal with water supply and quality issues. We do a lot of outreach and education with schools as well as townships on different ways that we can improve water quality and also use our water resources more sustainably. Um, so today we're going to talk about a couple of different things. In our last webinar, Heidi, our policy director, provided an overview of the Pinelands from the ecological perspective, also the political perspective, and then she also discussed a lot of the various aspects of the work we do here at the Alliance. Today, we're going to bring things a little bit closer to home. Because whether we live in the Pinelands or not, our relationship with the land starts where we live. So I'm going to give a brief recap of some of the things Heidi covered previously about the uniqueness of the Pine Barrens ecosystem. And then we're going to get into our general relationship with our land and by extension, our water. We will wrap things up with some things that we can all do to make things just a little bit better because we are, of course, people action. That's why you're all here today. But I'll cover the work that we are also doing here at PPA as well. Now, Heidi has a PhD in science. I was an undergraduate in philosophy, so you might find that our approaches or our ways of presenting are a little bit different. Um, but let's go ahead and get into it. So our Pine Barrens ecosystem. So our characteristics are generally we have sandy soil, acidic water, frequent fires, and an ecosystem that's reliant on fires in many ways. And then we have plants that are specially adapted for that. So our sandy soil. So with our sandy soil, that's got high drainage and generally low nutrients. So when we're talking about that from a water perspective, we have our sand, and then we have a layer of clay, which Heidi explained in detail about how that happened geologically as the ocean deposited sediment, as most of New Jersey's southern area was covered in water. And there's a layer of clay underneath. So that water seeps through the sand. It sits on that layer of clay. Hence, we have the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer Formation, which on a good day is holding approximately 17 trillion gallons of water. There are a lot of wetlands in the Pinelands. So anywhere where the water table meets the surface, you're going to have some type of wetland, whether that's a stream, a swamp, a bog. If we dig deep enough, we create lakes or ponds. But there's not really any natural lakes or ponds in the Pinelands. Those are usually areas where humans have excavated an area, or our friendly beaver has come in and flooded an area by damming up a stream. Our water in the Pinelands is generally acidic. The pH is going to be lower than 5, whereas normal pure water is going to be at about a 7 on the pH scale. And that creates a unique dynamic in the Pinelands, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth. So with the acidic water and the soil, it makes it a little bit more difficult for plants. They're going to have less nutrients available because of those acidic soils, and so they're going to have to adapt. And you're gonna see this this graphic here later in the presentation as well. So just keep this in mind. So if you see where the box is, this is generally where Pinelands water is, and you can see that it kind of creates this dynamic where a lot of nutrients you're not going to be able to, the soil won't hold those nutrients. And so we'll get into why that's important in terms of human development and human impacts in a little bit. All right, so like I said, so we've got this interesting dynamic, and so the plants have had to adapt to that. So they need to be able to survive in a low nutrient environment. They need to be able to deal with acidic water, and then also they need to be able to deal with frequent fires because that's a part of the Pinelands ecosystem as well. So in the Pinelands, we obviously have a lot of evergreen plants, which is an adaptation where the plant can preserve nutrients instead of dropping their leaves and storing all that energy in the ground during the winter. They keep those leaves and continue to eat the sun, eat sunlight. We also have carnivorous plants, so they've found a different adaptation in order to get their nutrients. They use insects and things that they capture on that sticky, those sticky filaments, and that's how they get their nutrients. You also have bladderwort, which if you've been in the Pinelands or have gone on any of our tours or anything like that, you probably have seen. These are also carnivorous plants, but they actually suck in microorganisms from within the water with their root system, which I won't get too in depth with today. That will be another presentation, or you can talk to Russell Jolig at NJCF, and he can give you a whole rundown about bladderwort. So we call it the Pine Barrens, but it's really not all that barren. It's just wasn't adapted to be able to grow the things that European colonizers came into the country and thought they wanted to, grow. Your traditional crops like wheat and barley and those types of things don't really do well in the Pinelands, but there are a lot of things that do very well in the Pinelands. So we have a lot of cranberry, obviously, in the Pinelands, and then we also have the blueberry. So this is actually the Pinelands is the birthplace of the commercial blueberry. All right, so those are sort of the some of the unique ecosystem traits that you'll find in the Pinelands, and we just kind of wanted to recap that from what Heidi's presentation covered, just to kind of put us on the same page before we get into the big portion of my presentation today. So I'm going to give you a quick disclaimer. The next part of this presentation is going to be a little bit bleak. I'm going to talk about how we treat our land, our water, and how our actions impact not just the Pinelands, but the state as a whole. I'm going to speak generally about the type of land use and development we see in New Jersey and the impacts we are also seeing from climate change, which are only expected to get worse. But after we get through that, we are going to see how small changes and how each individual can help shift the tide. This presentation is called Our Land and Our Waters because we have the greatest power in determining the future of the Pinelands and as well as our communities. Anyone who's watched Spider-Man, a Spider-Man movie knows with great power comes great responsibility. So we're going to get into some of those actions that we can take to make things just a little bit better. All right, so not such a long time ago, some advocates pushed for the protection of the pinelands. Politicians, power brokers, and some others came up with the comprehensive management plan on how to protect the pinelands by guiding growth and development to sort of the peripherals of the pinelands. And Heidi covered this in the last presentation more in depth. I just wanted to bring this up because this is sort of what we're going to dig into today about that development that's pushed to the peripherals, but how that can still impact the core of the pinelands. In many ways, the comprehensive management plan has been extremely successful, as you probably know. The pinelands themselves are a resilient ecosystem that has survived countless fires and even multiple rounds of clear cutting. But here comes the bleak part. Even if we were, and this is sort of a broad statement, but even if we were to permanently protect all of the remaining natural lands within the Pinelands boundaries, we would still be in danger of losing this amazing place because there's one thing the Pinelands may not be able to overcome, and that is chemistry. Keep that in mind as we move forward, because we're going to take a quick look at a typical development project that you might find. We'll say that this one is just outside of the Pinelands boundaries. So this is hypothetical, but it sort of reflects what you would typically see from some development projects or types of development in the Pinelands. All right, so we're going to start with a wooded lot. So you have a forest or even a savanna or a meadow, which acts as a sort of stormwater sponge. So it absorbs a lot of water. You don't have, nobody has to water this area. It takes care of itself. It uses the precipitation. You don't have to fertilize this area, and it provides a lot of habitat for animals. It it stores carbon. There's a lot of ecological benefits or gifts, however you want to call it or word it. It's overall in good health and it's providing a lot of services to us. Now, in comes a developer. They go ahead and clear that lot because it makes a blank slate makes it easier to build whatever the project may be. Let's say that this is maybe a 500 plus unit development project, a residential project. So when we clear this lot, there is some stormwater infiltration, but you're going to have soil compaction because of the heavy machinery that's doing the work. A lot of that soil can be washed away, which causes a lot of issues in streams. It's known as total suspended solids. So this is where you get that really muddy water when you have either erosion on the stream banks or if you have something like this upstream and a lot of that soil is washing away. Developers are supposed to install barriers to capture a lot of that soil, but if you've ever seen a development project, a lot of times that barrier gets damaged or blown in the wind or something happens and it's no longer fulfilling the function that it's supposed to. All right, so we've got the cleared lot. Now we start building. So we build the housing units, we build the driveways, the roads, and all of those are considered impervious surfaces. So these are all surfaces that water can no longer penetrate or no longer be absorbed into the ground. All of that is going to run off. And after we do all of the hardscaping, the building, then we come in and there was a sale at the local nursery. So we've got some Bradford pears put in. We've got a lot of turf lawn. some towns will require native plants to be put in for new developments and things like that, but generally the developer is going to go with what's cheapest or what's easily available, and that's oftentimes things that we probably don't want planted, and it's going to cause some problems down the road. There might be some habitat for wildlife. There might be people that come in and plant gardens and things like that. But generally, we're looking at a sort of a remade landscape with Bradford pears, maybe some crepe myrtles, possibly butterfly bush, things that can spread on their own and cause some issues. So if we zoom out, we might be looking at a development that sort of looks like this. You've got a lot of fragmentation here. So you've got some wooded areas remaining, but those are fragmented and they're cut off from other areas of forest. You've got pretty dense development in this one. A lot of the houses are sort of cookie cutter. Not to say anything against that. People need places to live, but we're going to kind of get into maybe some ways that we can do things better here in the future. So when we do this, they don't just, put in all these impervious surfaces. They may also be removing the top layer of soil. So if this is in and around the pine barrens or within the pinelands boundaries, then that can cause some additional issues for soil. You're kind of changing the soil chemistry, and that's kind of what we're going to be looking at a lot. But you're also taking away a lot of those ecological gifts that land would have had otherwise. You're also creating a lot of issues with stormwater because all of those impervious surfaces need to be managed somewhere. So typically a developer will come in and they'll dig a big ditch. They'll call it a retention pond or a detention basin. And that's supposed to, cover all of the account for all of the stormwater runoff, but it doesn't. All right. So what does that look like from an ecological perspective? So first, you've got some tree cover loss. So that might be from development. So this graphic that I'm going to show, and I'll play this here. This isn't just from development. This could also be from fire, but this is looking from satellite data about tree cover loss in the area. And you'll notice that the pink areas that show up here on the graphic are a lot of the places where if you're familiar with the Pinelands, that there's a lot of development pressure. But there's quite a bit of, here, I'll do my pointer here. So if you see all these pink areas, so these are all areas where there's a greater than 30% loss of tree cover. So you're losing a lot of trees in those areas. What does that look like from a biodiversity standpoint? So the areas in purple here are areas where biodiversity is considered to be intact. And what that means is that it is expected to be similar or equivalent to an area completely unimpacted by human activity. But you'll see that the tree cover loss map, as well as this biodiversity overlay, have a correlation. And this is all based on a 2019 study that was measuring forest biodiversity status and changes globally. So this was actually a global map, but this is just zooming in on New Jersey. But the other thing I want to kind of point out is that you can see, yes, it looks good. The core of the Pinelands is dark purple. It expected to have, intact biodiversity, but you can see all these sort of little chips here and there. And that's kind of the area that we're focusing on today, where human development is meeting these areas, sort of the edge of the Pinelands. The comprehensive management plan was meant to push development to these edges, but what we do in those edges, the peripheral of the Pinelands, can have a great impact on what actually happens in the Pinelands. And so you'll notice that these two maps, the tree cover loss, as well as the biodiversity map, they sort of match up with with this map. So this is a map that was created by the International Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. So they use satellite data and different, sources to develop a map of lawn areas, turf lawn areas. And so this study that they did led to the finding that lawn is the most irrigated crop in the country, which requires massive amounts of water. And if your soil isn't ideal for turf lawn, like in the Pinelands, massive amounts of fertilizer is required, and to maintain that lush green ecological desert. Um, and if you're going with a package deal with the landscaper in these areas, you can even maybe save if you add some pesticide treatment to the mix. So we're starting to get into that chemistry. But you'll see that, the Pinelands area here, where all that biodiversity is, there's not a whole lot of turf lawn, but there's certainly some. But you've got this megalopolis, going from New York down to, Baltimore and DC, where all these suburban areas and denser development areas are full of turf lawn. All right, so how do these general development practices and how does this turf lawn area and all that affect our water? We don't always think about it that way. We think we can do what we want on our property, and it's not necessarily having an impact, on our waterways, but in fact it is. Um, so where does rain go? Where does all the water go when it rains? The journey that precipitation takes can be very different depending on whether it falls on one of those well-vegetated wooded lots, like a forest, or on a sparse area like a grass field, or on impervious surfaces like those buildings and pavement. So we're going to take a look just at sort of three examples um, of how rain or stormwater interacts with different areas. So first, we're going to start with the forest. So I would think of a forest as one of those really big car wash sponges. It's going to absorb a lot of rain, and that absorption is slowly going to release in within the water table and slowly release into local streams or creeks or rivers. Um, it, think of it as a sponge, and then the sponge is sort of slowly letting that water out into the stream. So there's a steady stream flow in a lot of these areas where there's heavily forested, because that water is constantly sort of making its way into the stream under the ground. And so you also have a lot of trees, which are taking up a lot of that stormwater, a lot of that rainwater, and that water is either transpiring back into the atmosphere, or it's being stored within the tree itself for energy and for to continue photosynthesis. Um, the roots of the trees also open up avenues for water to make it into the groundwater table. So that's where you get that slow release into the local watershed. Now, when we move to grass lawn, I want you to think of grass lawn as this sort of scrubby green sponge. It's not really designed to absorb water. It's good for scrubbing, but it's only going to absorb a small amount of that rainfall or that storm water. The roots don't go very deep, so it's not really opening up any avenues into the groundwater table. The roots generally only go maybe 2 to 3 inches deep, whereas if you were to plant native grasses or sedges instead of those turf lawn grasses, you're going to have a couple of feet of roots under the ground that open up those avenues to the water table. All right, and so lastly, we're going to look at the impervious surfaces. So when we add concrete and asphalt or buildings, what are we looking at then? So we're basically just looking at runoff. So those surfaces aren't absorbing any water. That stormwater or rainfall is hitting those surfaces and it's moving downhill with gravity. So it might move from your house to the driveway, make its way onto your lawn, which will absorb maybe the first inch and a half of rainfall. Um, but beyond that, everything is running off. And that's sort of what this looks like if we're looking at different levels of development. So in a natural system, only about 10% of rainfall runs off. Most of that is absorbed into the ground, taken up by the trees, and through evapotranspiration makes its way back into the atmosphere. Whereas, as you can see, once you get to the urban environment, 55% of that rainfall or stormwater is running off. So that can lead to two things. It's carrying with it all of the things that are on the ground. So from litter to oil to fertilizers and pesticides, all of that is going to run off into local waterways. And it can also lead to flooding. So when you add all of this concrete and asphalt to the land, that water needs a place to go. If it's going into the natural systems, sometimes those natural systems, those creeks, those streams, those rivers can be overwhelmed and actually flood, or that water can settle into those low-lying areas and cause flooding where otherwise you probably wouldn't have seen that. So we are left with a choice. So this graphic here is great at showing sort of the difference. We can allow our landscape to be a green filter where that water is naturally filtered as it makes its way into the groundwater. Um, but it's not as black and white as this. We're going to get to that towards the end, but it doesn't have to be one or the other. We can have development and still manage and mitigate the effects of stormwater runoff and excess rainfall. Um, but let's see how. Well, first let's see what happens in the Pinelands. Um, so in the Pinelands, when you have all this runoff, which is carrying nutrients and different chemicals with it, we start seeing some impacts to the pH, and this is where that chemistry comes in. So a lot of the pineland species are adapted to this acidic water. If we start adding all kinds of new soils, so if I have to bring in topsoil to grow turf lawn, if I'm adding nutrients through fertilizer and I'm using pesticides, we're going to start to see chemical changes in our pinelands water as well as our soils. And once we start seeing that, then it opens a door for other organisms that wouldn't be there otherwise. So if you drove around at the beginning of April or late March, you probably saw a lot of trees that are blooming in white. So that's most likely a Bradford pear, which is considered an invasive species, but it's still available from landscapers and nurseries. Now, generally, that wouldn't do well in the pinelands, but you can see it making its way up, Route 206 or down Route 70, because as we change that environment and we add different soils and the pH starts changing, those species that wouldn't do well in the pinelands can now kind of make their way down those corridors, those highways for invasive species. Because every time an area along those roads are disturbed, the invasive species are generally the ones that are going to do the best, because deer aren't going to eat them down. Um, but the change in the soil pH and the water pH is what sort of allows a lot of that to happen. In your waters, you'll see if you start seeing bass or bullfrogs in a pinelands ecosystem, then that's sort of a sign of a degraded environment. So this doesn't necessarily happen frequently in the pinelands, but outside of the pinelands, if you get too many nutrients in your waterways, that can lead to algal blooms. So algal blooms are caused by eutrophication, which is really just a buildup of nutrients in a water body. This does occur naturally, let's say in a lake, as leaves and different debris settles at the bottom that builds up nutrients, which are made available as things help break it down, whether that's insects or microbacteria or fungi. That's all broken down, it turns into nutrients. So that can occur naturally. But in the human-built environment, it gets exacerbated by our fertilizers and our other nutrients that we're adding to the landscape. So you don't see this often in the pinelands because the pinelands are protected, but also because that acidic water will sort of fight that a little bit. It'll keep it from happening as it does outside of the pinelands. But the reason when it gets to a harmful algal bloom, which you've probably heard about in the news from time to time, that's when the algal blooms actually start dying off and releasing toxins, which can be dangerous to us as well as wildlife. But how are we doing in New Jersey as a whole? So I'm going to pull up some of the DEP data on water quality within the within the within the state. So first, I have to point this out. So every stream and every river and every creek and every lake and pond in New Jersey has what's called a designated use. So humans determine that this stream is only good for secondary recreation, or this stream we need to be able to consume the fish coming out of this body of water. Each one of those designated uses has a set of quality standards associated with that. So either the DEP or other organizations are going to test for different things within that stream or creek or river. And that testing can be done by state, federal agencies, public utilities, sometimes academia, nonprofits, as well as volunteers. Now, the Pinelands waters have their own category, which is essentially equivalent to Category 1 waters, which is the highest quality standards. But as we'll see on the next slide, so this overlay is looking at the 2022 integrated report, which is the most recent report that the DEP put out. This is a requirement through the Clean Water Act. Every state has to do this, but it's basically a report card for our water quality. So right now I have the aquatic life general designated use selected on this map. Not every body of water in New Jersey is designated for that use, but this can kind of give you a general idea of how we're doing. All of those areas that are sort of that spicy brown mustard color are what's called non-support. So those areas are not meeting the quality standards for that designated use. Now remember, like I said, all of the watersheds are not always designated as for this specific designated use, but really the only way this report looked any better is if we were to start selecting designated uses with a lower quality standard. So if I selected primary recreation, you would see some areas along the coast within the Pinelands and the Highlands turn green because they will support that designated use, which is mostly based on bacteria like E. coli. So they'll test for that and make sure that if we're coming in contact with those waters, that we're not going to get sick. So I'm not showing this to really scare anybody. If a water body isn't safe for a specific use, you'll see a warning sign, or there might be like a beach closure. So I'm showing you this because it doesn't really have to be this way. We can do better, but it's going to take all of us to make those changes. All right. So in addition to the things that are caused by human development and the way we use our land, we also have climate change and then our overuse, which is piling on to the issues. So you've got flooding. So climate change is generally expected to increase rainfall intensity within the state. Um, Now that might come in more severe storms rather than, prolonged periods of rainfall. That's more likely what we're going to see because then we're also going to get sort of these flash droughts. So right now we're in a drought warning or a drought warning. And really the only reason that we're probably not in a drought emergency right now where there would be mandatory restrictions for water is because last spring was one of the wettest on records. But then all of a sudden the rain stopped. The faucet turned off, and even though we're seeing more rain now, we still have this large deficit that we need to make up for. So unless we see a few weeks of above average rainfall, we're likely to either remain in a drought warning, or if the rainfall, the faucet turns off again, we're likely to make our way into a drought emergency at some point. All right, and so then we also have overpumping. So this video here is just from one of our websites, Save the Source, but it kind of shows, and I'll just let it play. It shows how the withdrawal of water either through for a town well, or let's say, there's a lot of irrigation in the area, and so they're pumping a lot of water. Maybe we hit one of those flash droughts, so people are pumping even more water. But how that can impact the local waterways, our wetlands, our streams. Um, and that's sort of just what this graphic is showing. But you see this in a lot of areas where overpumping is occurring. Now, if we're talking about close to the coastline, you also have the potential for saltwater intrusion. So as you pull that fresh water from the aquifer, that salt water has a sort of a path in, and now that salt water can come in. So you might have seen in Heidi's presentation, I think she showed a picture of ghost forests, so cedar trees that died off because they can't really tolerate salt water, and so if that salt water starts intruding in the aquifer or in those wetlands, then it can create a large area of die off for those cedars. All right, so we talked a lot about some of the issues. So this slide here, all right, no. Okay, so this slide here just shows the actual data from the Barnegat Bay from 2012, and so the graphic on the right side is a model. So if they were to institute nutrient total max daily loads, so if they were to limit the amount of, let's say, fertilizers that are allowed to be used in that area, what it could look like. So all of that red area is very nutrient rich, polluted runoff. If they were to, the DEP or the state were to implement a limit on the amount of fertilizer that can be used in that area, we would see almost immediate results. And that would, so it doesn't have to be this way. We can change things, and there's a lot of strategies to do that. We're going to start with talking about how each one of us can sort of turn the tide. Right. So how can we reverse some of these trends? The majority of our landscaping is creating stormwater and nutrient pollution problems for surrounding areas while serving almost no ecological purposes. So how can we turn this around? A more thoughtful approach to landscaping is required, which can start in our own backyards or front yards. So making the change. So here's some things that we can do at home. So we can reduce lawn area. That's one of the biggest ones. So lawn is really terrible for our watersheds. It cause you need to use a lot of water on it. You generally probably have to put fertilizers or other chemicals on it to maintain it. Now you can also do porous pavement. So that's a pavement or some sort of hardscaping that actually allows some of that water to infiltrate into the groundwater or the ground. You can use a rain garden or a rain barrel to capture or redirect stormwater. Um, and then native vegetation. So native vegetation is adapted to do well in this environment within New Jersey, within the soils of New Jersey. If you're in the Pinelands, there are Pineland specific plants that do very, very well in the Pinelands. But they generally, once they're established, they require a lot less watering. They generally don't require fertilizer, and they also provide habitat for wildlife that over millions of years have adapted to live side by side. So here are some of the goals that Doug Tallamy, the founder of Homegrown National Parks, he's a doctor, an entomologist at Delaware University. But here's four of the criteria that he sets for um, basically creating a habitat or wildlife friendly and watershed friendly landscape. So first, it must support a diverse community of pollinators throughout the growing season. So you're going to want to have native plants that are in bloom throughout the seasons. Um, they're, they must provide energy for the local food web. So oak trees are one of the biggest or best examples. So oak trees can support 300 to 400 different types of pollinator species. So that's moths, butterflies. So caterpillars feed off the leaves. They use it as a host plant. Um, they also provide energy through the acorns for birds and mammals. And then, so the third one is they must manage the watershed in which they lie, which turf lawn does not do a very good job with. Um, and they must remove carbon from the atmosphere. So grass will or turf lawn will remove or capture a tiny bit of carbon, whereas if you have trees and other native shrubs and perennials in your garden or on your lawn, um, then that's going to take a lot more carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, this picture here is actually where I live. So we've got a small bog garden, but we're installing a rain garden in the back here. So that's going to take most of the rain, the roof runoff. We're going to try and do it from both sides to go into that garden. But generally, a rain garden is simply you're digging out a little bit of area rather than building up a garden bed. But it's designed to capture that stormwater, help it infiltrate into the ground over 24 to 48 hours so you don't get mosquitoes. And then we're planting all native stuff in here. So we've got some blueberries, we've got some serviceberry. As you can see, this is pineland soil, so it's very absorbent. And we're going to plant a lot of things that do well in that type of soil. And the reason we do that from a habitat perspective, because if you want to see things like the eastern tiger swallowtail, you've got to provide some of its food sources, and that's generally a lot of our native plants. If you want to see the monarch butterfly, you're going to have to plant milkweed and have some of those other native species that it relies on for food. Um, Same thing with native bees. If we want to keep our native bees around, whether that's solitary bees or whether that's our bees that we use for honey, if we want our plants pollinated and then we need these things, we're going to have to plant the things that they use for energy and food. Box turtles, the same thing. If we want them around, we're going to need to plant those berries that they eat and the May apple that they like. For ruby-throated hummingbirds, we're going to have to plant propagate the plants that they like to use for food and energy. All right, so if we're going to the managing of the watershed, we can go back to those rain gardens and rain barrels. So rain barrels will only take about 55 gallons of water, obviously, but you can use those to water either your small area of turf lawn or water your flower gardens or plants when it's not raining. So that can be useful. And then the rain gardens can look as uniform or as manicured as you'd like. So a lot of people think of rain gardens as this wildflower, sort of chaotic landscaping, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Really, the only criteria is that it's capturing that stormwater. If you want to plant, bushes that look very uniform and distinct, and you want to mulch that, that's okay. You can do that. Here's sort of the anatomy of a rain garden. Um, and the important part is that it's a depression rather than building up a garden bed, because it's meant to capture that rainwater. So you'll have an inlet. Generally, you'll surround that with rocks so it doesn't cause any erosion, and then you'll have an overflow with the same thing, some stone in place so it doesn't cause erosion. But as far as what you plant in the middle, we obviously advocate for native plants, but you can make those as manicured as you'd like. And so that's going to bring us into the landscape makeover program. So at PPA, we're recognizing that this idea that the pinelands can't just be protected by land preservation. We also have to implement better practices in the peripherals or in those areas that are developed in and around the pinelands. So back in 2017, my boss Jacqueline and a lot of other nonprofits got together and put together what's called the Landscape Makeover Program. So the way this program runs is that we have informational sessions to talk to people about what rain gardens and green stormwater infrastructure is. So there's a learning aspect. And then from there, we offer designs. So we do municipal projects. So we'll work with townships to install green stormwater infrastructure on public lands. And then we'll also provide resources for homeowners to do so on their own properties. So Rutgers is one of our partners. Their engineers and landscape architects will sit down with homeowners and come up with a plan or a rain garden design. It could also be a bioswale, or if you're living actually on a stream or on a lake, they might actually just design a buffer. So that will help keep some of those excess nutrients and other runoff from going into those water bodies. And then we help build those municipal projects. So through our grants, we fund the installation of these projects again on public lands, and then traditionally, we've provided rebates to homeowners who install rain gardens, who get the design from Rutgers and then install rain gardens. We're going to try some different approaches with the next round of grant funding. We may actually put teams together to install these things for homeowners. It seems to be a little bit of a barrier trying to get some homeowners to be able to do this type of work on their own. So we're gonna try and provide some additional assistance. We may also look into just paying, a landscaper to install the garden. All right, so what our program sort of looks like. So this is our stats from last year. So between municipal gardens and homeowner gardens, we installed about 6,000 square feet of green infrastructure, which is mainly rain gardens. That's those 6,000 square feet are now capturing and treating over 250,000 gallons of runoff per year. So these gardens you may see around your own town, they might not look like much, but they're capturing a lot of rainfall throughout the year, and capturing and treating that. So that water is making its way into the groundwater table, being naturally filtered by the soils, and it's keeping those excess nutrients and other contaminants from making their way into our waterways. And our most recent grant funding came from the DEP, and so it's focused on five lakes in the Pinelands and 5 lakes in the Highlands. So we're working with the Highlands Coalition up north, to try and keep runoff from making its way into our lakes. And we're not the only show in town. There are others. So you do have some certification sort of programs through Jersey Friendly Yards, through the National Wildlife Federation, where you can get your property certified as a habitat. And so if you go to jerseyyards.org, you'll find some resources there that can kind of guide you. They have a great plant database for native plants. If you type in a plant that's not native, oftentimes it will recommend native plants to substitute. Um, your community can actually get certified under the National Wildlife Federation program. So if you get enough residents in your town to become certified as, a habitat individually, you can then get your town certified as a habitat. So the ones I know of in our area, Cherry Hill, Marlton Lakes recently received that certification. And then you can also register your property in homegrown national parks. So that's another resource as well. They provide a lot of resources about keystone native plant species. So those plant species that will give you the most bang for your buck ecologically. All right, so now we're just going to kind of go through a sort of timeline about some of the water issues and things. So PPA has been advocating for water resources since its founding in 1989. So in 2002, the Berlin well was closed. So the Berlin well was draining in nearby wetlands, which was in violation of the Pinelands and state protection. So the state responded to pressure from PPA as well as residents, which ended up shutting down the well, making it the first time the state had shut down a permanent well because of ecological impacts. And it wasn't just ecological impacts, people were complaining about the water smelling funny, and tasting funny because it was coming from a local wetland. And so in 2017, like I said, the Landscape Makeover Program was established to provide those resources for people that are trying to transition from those Levittown sort of corporate models for their community, where it's a lot of turf lawn, a lot of foreign plant species that are planted by the developer. And you're one of the first people to see our new logo for the Landscape Makeover Program, which was done by Alan and Susan Crawford. All right, and so another thing that you'll hear about later in our webinar series is our regenerative farm. So Jeff Tober here will be presenting on how regenerative agriculture can also help with our impacts, our land impacts to our waterways. And that was started in 2020. And then we have our Kirkwood Comanche aquifer protections, which were amendments to the comprehensive management plan that further protect the aquifer from overuse or overpumping. And so the Pinelands Commission adopted the CMP amendments, which placed tighter restrictions on water withdrawals, but it also requires an additional review. So the state, the DEP, requires any withdrawal from a well that of 100,000 gallons a day or more they require a permit. So they have to go through a process with the DEP. These new CMP amendments now require that anything within the Pinelands boundaries of 50,000 gallons a day or more has to go through a permitting process with the Pinelands Commission. So there's a little bit of added scrutiny. These added protections made it more difficult to do any sort of inter or intra-basin transfer. So taking water from one watershed and releasing it somewhere else, or taking water from one watershed within the Pinelands to supply another watershed is also a little bit more difficult, and it's going to cause a lot more. There's going to be a lot more scrutiny from the Pinelands Commission. All right, and then so currently another area where we're trying to help with our water issues in the state is the Black Run Preserve. So an area that's considered headwaters of the Black Run Preserve is still open to development. It's zoned as currently as a rural development area, so there are some limits on the type of density that you could build in that area. But we've advocated for the Pinelands Commission to change that to forest area, which would decrease the amount of homes or development on a certain number of acres. We're also going to try and eventually permanently protect this area. It's one of the few remaining headwaters areas that are intact that aren't protected at the moment. So overall, we're trying to find a balance. How can we promote development and growth? Because we do need that, right? There's a lot more people. People want to live in New Jersey. People want to live near the Pine Barrens. So how do we find that balance between the two? And we're going to continue to fight these battles, but a lot of it is going to take place within the human built environment. So changing those sort of Levittown, those corporate models for housing developments into more sustainable models. But that's basically all I have. We are making progress. Green stormwater infrastructure is now the norm, or it's supposed to be the norm. People still can get away with, installing retention basins and things like that, based on, the engineers come in and they say we can't manage this amount of stormwater on property or something like that, or they try and mitigate it elsewhere. There are ways and loopholes around it, but it is sort of slowly taking over as the norm. And we will continue to fight for water supply and water quality issues moving forward in different areas where we see issues. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think we will have some time for questions, but on May 28th, Jason, our public lands advocate, will be presenting on how we see public lands and how we are going about protecting those public lands. All right, so Rachel, if we want to open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so we're at time, so if anyone has to hop off, totally understand. But if you have questions and you want to stay on a little bit later, you're welcome to throw them in the Q&A or even just raise your hand, click the little raise button, and you can unmute yourself and ask any questions. Otherwise, thank you, and I will be sending out a follow-up email with the link to register for the next webinar and a recording for this. All right, I'm gonna unmute Amanda. So Amanda, I think I'm going to allow your mic and then you just have to unmute yourself. I know we've had issues with this in the past. It takes a little bit of time sometimes. And Amanda, if you can't find the unmute button, you can always just type it in the chat if that's easier. In the meantime, Karen had a question. What recommendations do you have for a 55 plus community?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of those are more at least especially in our area. So I drive through Manchester every day, and there's quite a few 55 and older communities, and they do sort of take that a lot of times that cookie cutter approach to building um, when they build the development, but that doesn't mean that you have to keep it that way. So if there's an HOA, making sure that that HOA doesn't prohibit native landscaping. There's other things that I didn't really mention, but setting up a water quality program within your development or within your town. In a way, you would be sort of adopting your local stream, and maybe you're taking a closer look. You're doing some educational things. Well, the Watershed Institute has a training program where they can actually show you how to monitor your local stream by collecting macroinvertebrates or doing different types of water sampling. Um, but those programs, the National Wildlife Federation Certified Habitat, it sets up some criteria. If you want to sort of turn your community into one of those more sustainable, habitat friendly communities, you can sort of take those steps and start implementing those. So some of that is just installing native plants on your property, providing a water source for birds and other wildlife. If you're really concerned about your local water quality, um, reaching out to us and we can talk to you about rain gardens and rain barrels. But making sure your community is set up for that, that they don't have prohibitions on that sort of thing, because there are a lot of communities that still want to see, lawn in your front lawn. So you might be able to start in your backyard, but there might be some requirements that you have to overcome, or take it to your HOA and try and change those rules. So there's a lot of different things that you can do, but starting by reducing lawn area is a great start. Um, if you can take 10 to 20% of your lawn and turn that into a native plant garden, that's a great way of starting. And if you can encourage other people in your community to do that, you're going to end up making a pretty significant difference.
Thank you, Steve. I want to just give Amanda an opportunity if she is able to unmute, and then if not, I can move on to the next question.
Okay, so
Can
I
you
see,
get
yeah, I
Anne's
see the other.
question?
Yeah, so
Hmm.
the question is, if anybody can't see it, if you were to commit to installing local plant life in the lawn area, do you have to change the consistency of the soil to help survival? Generally, no. So if you're installing or if you're planting native plants, they're generally adapted for this area. You may want to look into those plants specifically to see what types of soil they do well in. Um, you may want to look and see how compacted your soil is. So like I said in the presentation, a lot of times when they're building these developments, they're using a lot of heavy machinery. Those soils are compacted. But if you're able to plant native plants in there, those native plants will help loosen that soil up and then sort of create a system where it's more absorbent. Those roots will make their way into that soil and they'll create more of a sponge by opening up those pathways through their roots. And as far as like soil amendments, you can look into that. Rutgers, will do for I think it's like $20. Through the Master Gardener programs, they'll do like a soil analysis for you. I mean, you can always add a little bit of fertilizer or time release fertilizer to get things started, but generally with native plants, you shouldn't necessarily have to do a whole lot like that.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. I think Amanda's trying to get back in, so we'll give that a second if possible. Okay. Yeah, if anyone else has anything else, otherwise we'll wrap it up. And thank you for attending today. And thank you, Stephen, so much for all that information.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
All right,
Have
have
a
a
great
great
day.
day. Bye.